Caramba, o Eduardo vai apresentar a live hoje de camiseta. Nada disso, eu tô de férias, turma. 2 semaninhas, eu tava precisando tanto. A saúde pegou esse ano, foi difícil, assim, manter o mínimo de saúde adequada para conseguir levar toda essa nossa caminhada, com todo esse empenho que a gente levou, com toda essa nossa força, com todo esse nosso direcionamento e enfrentamento. E tem uma hora que a saúde grita, né? Então eu tirei alguns diazinhos aí para poder recuperar. E durante essas semanas, são poucas semanas, vocês vão ter aulas incríveis com os maiores professores e professoras do ICL, que estão entre os maiores intelectuais do mundo. A gente está falando de Noam Chomsky, Leonardo Boff, está falando de Wolfgang Schluchter, estamos falando do querido Gessé, enfim, nomes incríveis. E uma surpresa, ao final dessas aulas, que são aulas históricas, aulas exclusivas para quem é membro e membra do ICL, que vocês vão poder assistir hoje e nos próximos dias, ao final da aula, quem se inscrever no ICL no plano anual vai ganhar de presente entregue em casa a minha trilogia Desvendando o Capitalismo. Aproveita a chance de assistir essa aula histórica, que é exclusiva para membros do ICL. E no final, aproveita a chance para vir para o ICL também. Essa revolução precisa de você. Um abraço e boa aula.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Wolfgang Schluchter from Heidelberg University, and it is my pleasure to give some lectures to you in ICL. The first lecture has the title, Duality of Structure and Action, an outline of a research program. And I will turn now to the PowerPoint presentation with this title. And the title relates to one important person in the history of sociology by the name of Max Weber. And I'm going to tell you the way in which I regard this research program, which was introduced by Max Weber, and I'll do that in 6 steps. First, I will talk a little bit about this concept of research programs. Then I will show you the way in which James Coleman, a famous American sociologist, has interpreted the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, one of the most important pieces Weber has ever written in 1904 and 1905. And in a revised version also in 1920. Then I will discuss this proposition and will revise it myself. And in the final fourth and fifth step, I will talk a little bit about the theory of the actor in rational choice theory and in the way in which we can modify also this approach. And I will end up with a short conclusion. So 6 points, and I will start with the first point. The first point has to do with the question, what is a research program? A research program, in my view, can best be interpreted by a famous philosopher by the name of Lakatos. And he argued a research program consists of a hardcore, which is protected by a belt, and it develops a negative and a positive heuristics, and we will later see what this means in detail. And for this purpose, to argue that Max Weber has developed a research program, we need, of course, to edit his work, and this was done recently after 40 years of work, and we have now a complete edition of his writings, his lectures, as well as his letters, very important part of his work, altogether 54 volumes. And we have to interpret this voluminous work on the one hand, and we have also to explicate what Weber's approach means to us nowadays. And explication means, in my view, that you do not only follow the problem formulation by Weber, but you do not follow the problem solution in all regards. Now let me first develop a little bit more this idea of a scientific research program. And the central point is the question which has to be resolved: is scientific progress occurring continuously, step by step, or is it developing in ruptures, in revolutionary waves? And there was a very long lasting discussion between three important scholars, Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, and last but not least, Imre Lakatos, whom I mentioned already. Karl Popper argued that scientific progress is achieved by way of conjectures and refutations, and the major instrument to come to better solutions of scientific problems is falsification. You have to have hunches, and then you have to falsify these hunches. And if you are successful in falsification, you approach the truth step by step. But for that purpose, you need also theoretical pluralism, not only one approach, but a multiplicity of approaches, tackling with the same problem. Now, in contradistinction to Popper, Thomas Kuhn argued the way in which scientific progress is achieved is not step by step, not continuously. It is done in ruptures. There is always at the beginning a disciplinary matrix, a kind of frame which everybody shares. And within this frame, there is a game going on which can be called a puzzling, like a puzzle. You try to solve little problems within the frame which are accepted by everybody in the game. But then you encounter increasing anomalies, and therefore, after a while, the frame itself becomes scrutinized, and then after a while, a revolution of the frame occurs, and then a new game starts. Now, as you can see, the position of Karl Popper and of Thomas Kuhn are quite opposite to each other. And therefore, there was a question of their third position, and the third position was introduced by Imre Lakatos, because he argued both sides has some reasonable arguments, and we have to combine these arguments. And in order to avoid what he called instant rationality, that you give away with a proposition right away because it was falsified, you should stick to one basic conviction, and that is the hardcore of your research program. And this is protected by a negative heuristic, protected by a belt. And from there you can, of course, try to proliferate your theories. And this is achieved by the usage of a positive heuristic. Now, this Lakatos calls scientific research programs. And there are several of these programs, but the point is there must be a hardcore which cannot be falsified right away. And then there are theories which can be falsified. And this combination of a core and a belt of possible falsifications, this is what he calls a research program. And my view is now that Max Weber, who was born in 1864 and died 100 years ago in 1920, that Max Weber has such a research program, and the hardcore of this program is an anthropology. The notion that man as a sensual and reasonable being is capable of conducting his or her life, and therefore this assumption that man is a reasonable, essential and reasonable being cannot be falsified. It must be the core of any sociology or any theory that is termed a sociological theory. And Weber's theories, therefore, are all aiming at an analysis of conduct of life under modern and past conditions in comparative perspectives. Now we come to the second point, namely the interpretation of Weber's famous study on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism by James Coleman, a famous American sociologist who has written a huge book entitled Sociological Foundation. He himself argues that the study of Weber, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, as I already mentioned, written down in 1904 and 1905 and then revised in 1920, can be regarded as a viable explanatory model in sociology. Why? Because it realizes the macro-micro-macro link. The macro-micro-macro link. And therefore, Coleman argues, Weber adhered to methodological individualism in explaining macro phenomena. Now, what is the opposite position? The opposite position would be the argument that we have macro level propositions which can be verified. Such a macro level proposition would be religious values of a society are the cause for economic organization of a society. You have two macro phenomena. Religious values, cultural on the one hand, and economic organization on the other. And they are related right away in a causal manner. Now, this argument, Coleman argues, has to be rejected because there are no such macro level propositions in sociology which can be justified. What we need is rather a kind of detour, if you wish, from the macro level to the micro level and from the micro level again back to the macro level. So the relationship between two macro phenomena is not directly, it is achieved by way of the micro analysis. Therefore, we have to consider 3 steps for a proper explanation of the relationship between the Protestant ethic and capitalism, as Weber has put it in his famous study. And he argues the first step is therefore that in the process of education and socialization, Protestant religious doctrines generate certain values in its adherents. That's the first step. From macro to micro. Then on the micro level, individual with certain values referred to in Proposition 1 adopt certain kinds of orientation to economic behavior. The central orientation to economic behavior are characterized by Weber as being anti-traditionalist and duty to one's calling. Duty to one's calling. That is, so to speak, the second step on the micro level, from micro to micro. And the third step then is back to the macro level, certain orientation to economic behavior, referred to in Proposition 2, on the part of individuals help bring about capitalist economic organization in a society. So that is Coleman's interpretation of Weber's famous study on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and he is very in favor of Weber's approach in this regard. Now, we can therefore formulate our problem in 3 steps. There is first the problem of defining the situation, that is a macro-micro link. Then there is a problem of selecting a course of action, that is in micro link. And the third problem is transforming a multiplicity of actions into a macro phenomenon, the micro link. That's more abstract formulation of what Coleman had in mind. Defining the situation, selecting the course of action, transforming the multiplicity of actions into a macro phenomenon. And this model can be applied to any empirical instance you might come up with. It's not confined to religion, economic organization. It can be applied to any social phenomena of interest to you. Now, is this a correct interpretation of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism? My hunch is no, it is not a proper interpretation of Weber's approach. First of all, Weber does not explain the emergence of capitalism, but the emergence of the spirit of capitalism. Now, that's a difference. Capitalism and spirit of capitalism are two different entities. So Weber never claimed that he had explained the emergence of modern capitalism in his study on the Protestant ethic. The second point, therefore, Weber stresses not only what he calls this side of the causal chain, he also argues there is another side to this causal chain, and therefore my analysis is not one-sided, it is two-sided. Now we can explain this approach in a chart which I have developed. On the one hand, there is which can account, and there's the other side, a figuration of order, you might say structures and institutions, which are then mediated by the actor and become a new configuration of order in the third step. So the full-fledged analysis we have in the Protestant ethic is not in the Protestant ethic itself, it must be complemented with other parts of Weber's work. Namely those parts where he dealt with the problem of figuration of orders and the way in which figuration of orders develops over time. And therefore, the full-fledged picture we get from the explanatory model of Max Weber is not the model which was introduced by Coleman. It is a much more complicated model, which I presented to you now. Also, however, in three steps. First, the structure of the situation. Secondly, the selection of course of action. And finally, the transformation of a multiplicity of action, creating a new structure, a concerted action, you might say. And there is another very important distinction in Weber's analysis, namely the distinction between causal analysis and elective affinity. Elective affinity is not a causal interpretation of two phenomena causing each other. It is only a kind of correlation between two phenomena, and a correlation is, as you know, not a causal interpretation. Two things can come together, but that doesn't mean that they cause each other. So Weber was very clear on that there is only an elective affinity between this new spirit of capitalism and the structure of the new capitalism. It's not the culture that has produced the structure, nor the structure that had produced the culture. They have independent causes. His old sociology of religion is meant to demonstrate the importance of culture as a viable force in order to bring about new cultures which then interact with structures so that you can have this combination, this elective affinity between what he calls spirit and form. Now, therefore, we have these three relationships: the macro-micro link, which is performed by internalization and sanctioning of people, or of actors, or of agencies, as it is called nowadays very often. Then we have the macro-micro link, the motivation, life conduct, and action of people, or multiplicity of people, also of collectivities, you might say. And then three, the micro-macro link, where new legitimation is necessary for a new constellation and a new appropriation of means of production and things like that are achieved. So we have now the full-fledged argument, which we find in Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, as an explanatory device for sociology, for sociological theory. Now, the decisive point here in this whole argument is, of course, the actor or the agency. The agency is necessary in order to connect the macro level 1 with the macro level 2. Without actor or agency, there is no such relationship between macro and macro phenomena. They are always mediated by way of actors, be it a single individual, be it a collectivity, or a stratum, or a class. So in any case, the actor in this kind of analysis is regarded, and this is true also for Coleman, is regarded as a decision maker. And he is not only regarded as a decision maker, the actor is also regarded as a person that pursues his or her self-interests. So he is a kind of egoistic actor. The actor does this, at the third point, in a rational manner. And last but not least, very important, any action of the actor has not only intended but also unintended, unforeseen consequences, which might further the common good or which might destroy the common good. Both possibilities are there. But each action, whether it is rational or non-rational, will produce consequences which are unintended and unforeseen. So the plan of the actor never materialized totally, so to speak. Now, how can this process be formalized? We find here again very interesting arguments in Coleman and in rational choice theory. That is the mode of thinking which is at the center of Coleman and of Coleman's analysis and of other famous scholars in sociology who adhere to the program of rational choice theory. Now, in this theory, the actor is regarded as a resourceful, restricted, evaluating, expecting, and maximizing human being, pursuing his or her subjectively expected utility. Subjectively expected utility. The so-called SEU calculus. The SEU calculus. And the SEU calculus reads utility, U, times P, probability of the outcome of one's action, yields the SEU value. So you can really formalize, so to speak, any action you might take from the point of view of your expectations of the utility you might gain with this kind of action and the probability of its positive outcome for your own purposes, and that yields SEU value. And then the argument is a rational actor who is, or agency, who is really adhering to rational standards will pick the course of action with the highest SEU value. Now that sounds a very interesting model, and as in case of the Protestant ethic, I'm really challenging this model to a certain extent, not totally, but to a certain extent, because I think it is one-sided. And if we go back to Weber again, to the Weberian approach, we will see that the actor has to be conceptualized in a much more sophisticated way than it is true for the rational choice model. Now, first of all, when we want to revisit the actor with regard to this proposition put forward by rational choice theory, we can first we have first to emphasize that Weber's sociology is an interpretive sociology, eine verstehende Soziologie. Interpretation is very crucial to Weber's analysis of action theory. Why? Because the actor is indeed oriented toward goals, and this orientation has meaning to it. And this meaning can be interpreted by the observer, because we as observer are actors as well, and therefore we know the way in which we normally would orient our action. Therefore, the first important distinction is between behavior and action. Why is this distinction so important? Because behavior is, in contradistinction to action, something that has no meaning to it, according to Weber. Action starts when the orientation becomes meaningful. Meaningful action, meaningful behavior, so to speak. Meaningful behavior is action. Meaningful behavior can be defined as action. So sociology starts only with action, not with behavior. Behavior is something that is all taken into account, of course, because most parts of our lives are performed in terms of behavior rather than of action, but only when behavior becomes meaningful and therefore action, then sociology steps in. Now, if action is the basic term in sociology, then we have to distinguish between routinized versus non-routinized action. Routinized action is something that is meaningful action, of course, but it has become so normal that nobody would be able to understand this meaning kernel in it, really, without scrutinizing it deeply. Therefore, the main emphasis in sociology is, of course, not on routinized action, but on non-routinized action. Non-routinized action can appear in two different modes, namely spontaneous, very spontaneous, or rule-bound. And rule-bound action is, of course, again, an action that is subdivided in two types of rule-bound action, namely according to technical versus according to normative rules. Technical rules are rules of prudence rather than rules that has to be obeyed and are connected with sanctions, because the negative consequences will come out right away when the action is done in an imprudent way. Then you will not achieve your goal. But normative actions are different from technical. Normative rules are different from technical rules, because normative rules requires normally sanctions, are connected with sanctions. If you violate a normative rule, let's to say you should not murder your fellow man, and you commit a murder, it's not quite clear whether you will be uncovered, whether you will be caught, whether you will be brought to justice. That's not so clear. Therefore, you need sanctions in order to connect the norm with its consequences. So behavior is not action. Action is meaningful behavior. Then routinized versus non-routinized action is the next distinction. Then within non-routinized action, spontaneous and rule-bound action, and within rule-bound action, we have this crucial difference between technical and normative rules. Now that is the level of orientation of the actor. But second, very important point is the coordination of action. The coordination of action means that at least two actors or more than two are connected with each other, are performing interactions, not only action, but interactions. And again, we can distinguish between various forms of interaction and the regularities coming out of these interactions. And the most important, very often performed mode is usage and customs. So that's like the routinized action on the level of the individual actor, on the level of coordination. But then we have two very important different modes of connecting it with each other. The first one is interests. We have interests in other people because they can further my own interests, or we have other interests which are common to us. And last but not least, belief in validity of a coordination of action. And this is true for all forms of domination. The domination must always be connected with a belief in validity, according to Weber. So the sociology of domination is a very important piece in his sociology, which has to do with belief in validity, in contradistinction to the market, where interests are paramount. So we have a much more differentiated picture. And I have put together all these arguments in this chart, which you will not be able to understand right away. And I'm not going to explain it in all details, but I will demonstrate one important aspect of this chart to you. The first one is the headline, Weber's typology of orientation and coordination of action. So Weber never left it with the orientation. He was very interested in the coordination of action, in what is called interaction. And some sociologists argue that sociology is nothing else but a theory of interaction. But Weber argues, no, it's orientation and coordination of action. And if you follow the upper row, paragraph 2, 3, 5, and 12, taken from his basic sociological terms, which he published in 1920 in his famous book, Economy and Society, chapter 1, then you see that's a logical sequence. It's not a genetic sequence, it's a logical sequence. So you can have action without social relationship, legitimate order, and organization. But you cannot have organization without legitimate order, without social relationship, and without action and social action. And the same holds for social relationship. You cannot have social relationship without action and social action, but you do not need a legitimate order for social relationship or even an organization for social relationship. You can have social relationship without organization and without a legitimate order. However, if you have a legitimate order, then you need also social relationship and action and social action as a consequence of the way in which the legitimate order is conceptualized, namely as indirect mutual relatedness and subjective meaning variably related to maxims, to rules, to maxims. And in organization, these maxims are always supported by sanctions. So that's the first very important thing you find in Max Weber's famous book, Economy and Society. which, by the way, is not a book, but that is not important here. Chapter 1, basic sociological terms. And these basic sociological terms can be arranged on the level of orientation in terms of traditional, affectual, instrumental, rational, and value rational orientation. That is developed in paragraph 4. And as we have seen right away, the social relationships can be conceptualized in terms of usage, custom, interest, and belief and validity. So we have two basic modes of coordination, namely principle of exchange, institutionalized in markets, principle of legitimacy, institutionalized in organizations. And by the way, that's a very crucial point here. Although we normally would argue that sociology has to do with society, Weber never defined society as a basic concept. It's a principle of exchange, institutionalized in markets, principle of legitimacy, institutionalized in organizations and in legitimate orders. And therefore, the title of Economy and Society properly formulated is not economy and society, but the economy and the relationship to the other societal orders and powers, And the other societal orders and powers are the polity, the religious order, the family, art, and science, and so on and so forth. So the society is subdivided into different orders which are related to each other in a peculiar way, and that yields a theory of differentiation. Now, what can we now infer from this exposition with regard to the concept of the actor, which I mentioned before, with regard to rational choice theory? The actor, of course, is a resourceful, restricted, evaluating, and expecting entity. That's true. But as we have seen now, he is also a communicating and reciprocating human being, capable of developing an identity and conducting his life on the basis of strong evaluations. I take this from Charles Taylor, the famous Canadian philosopher, who has distinguished between weak and strong evaluations. Crucial, therefore, is Weber's distinction between purposive rational or instrumental rational, as it is very often translated, and value rational. And we can define purposive rational as, by the definition of purpose Weber has put down in his studies on methodology in social sciences. There he argues purpose is the notion of a success that becomes the cause of an action. The notion of a success that becomes the cause of an action. So it's a purposive rational orientation means you are success oriented. You want to achieve a success. And for that, you need normally rules of prudence. You have to observe rules of prudence. Value, on the other side, is the notion of a validity that becomes the cause of an action. And in case of a validity, you normally do not want to be successful at any rate. You want to do something for its own sake, So the notion of validity that becomes the cause of an action. And this can be supported much more so by modern philosophy, but I will skip this interpretation and come back to this distinction between two types of rationality, the double meaning of rationality. And you could say purposive rationality is always a prudent adjustment to the situation, a model of reality, whereas value rationality is shaping the situation model for reality. And so we can say the actor is not only a selecting, but also a committed subject. So that's a full-fledged notion of the actor as we find it in Weber's basic sociological terms and in his sociology as such. Now, interestingly enough, and I will not skip this chart because it's so important, there is an internal relationship between two types of orientation, namely the affectual and the value rational orientation. And I've put down here a longer quotation taken from Economy and Society, chapter 1. And I read it to you because it shows that Weber had a clear-cut understanding of the difference between instrumental rational and value rational action, and that value rational action is much more developed than it is normally accepted in the secondary literature. The quote reads as such: "The orientation of value rational action is distinguished from the affectional type," the second one, affectual action, "by its clearly self-conscious formulation of ultimate values governing the action and the consistently planned orientation of its detailed course to these values." There is irrationality. At the same time, and that's now crucial, and that's not true for affectual action. At the same time, the two types have a common element, namely that the meaning of the action does not lie in the achievement of a result ulterior to it, like in success-oriented action, but in carrying out the specific type of action for its own sake, And that's important. Affectual action and value rational action have some elective affinity to each other, and that's not true for instrumental rational action. Now, what follows from this, contrary to a widespread opinion in the secondary literature, especially by Jürgen Habermas, value rationality is not secondary to purposive rationality. Rather, it is the other way around, as we have seen. So, we come to our conclusion. And we can state Weber's interpretive sociology can be regarded as an explanatory social science, explanation by way of interpretation, which provides macro-based explanations in the context of a multi-level and two-sided analysis. Multi-level, macro, and two-sided, the cultural side on the one hand, and the institutional and structural side on the other, and the interplay between these two sides, which are mediated by agencies that have orientation and are capable of coordination. So Weber's sociology is an example of a third type of sociology beyond methodological individualism and methodological holism, relating structure and action, and I call this methodological relationism. And it is combined with a theory of a complex and multi-level concept of rationality. So far, our interpretation of Weber's research program in broad strokes. And in the following lectures, we'll go into some details of his work, but we'll also relate his work to other authors like Karl Marx on the one hand and Emil Durkheim and modern authors on the other. So, see you then. Thank you for your attention.